Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Great. Hi, thanks for coming tonight. My name is Michael Brownlee. I'm one of the co-founders, along with Lynette Marie Hanthorne back here somewhere, of the Local Food Shift group. And the mission of our organization is to localize the global food supply, starting in the Front Range of Colorado. And we've been learning that localizing our food supply as much as possible is essential, because our globalized, industrialized food supply chain is completely unsustainable and increasingly unstable. This global food juggernaut is burning 23% of our fossil fuels and contributing as much as 49% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. And it has become an overwhelming contributor to species extinction, global warming, fossil fuel depletion, declining economies, increasing human health costs, decreasing human life expectancy, the diminishing of community, and the loss of the sacred. We can also say now that a gathering storm of global conditions is likely to reduce total global food production capacity by 20 to 30% over the next 2 or 3 decades. And since during this time, human population is expected to increase dramatically, headed, some say, by 2050 to 9 or 10 billion people, this collision of rising demand for food and diminishing supply will bring food to the forefront of emerging human calamities. The resulting suffering will affect first and third worlds alike. So we who are aware of these trends are then left to grapple with the urgent question of how humanity will feed itself in the face of this unfolding disaster. We feel that we need not change the industrial food system, because it will fail of its own accord. We must instead build a parallel system that will enable humanity to feed itself in a sustainable way and to weather the coming storm. We know that our mandate is not to feed the world as our conventional farmers have been taught, but to feed our local populations first, and to empower other communities to do the same. This must be our goal everywhere. The future of food, if there is to be one, is local as possible, as close to home as possible. What's local? As Joan Gussow says, local is the distance the heart can travel. So here's what it comes down to. We must reinvestigate, reevaluate, rethink, reinvent, redesign, and rebuild every aspect of our food supply chain from the farm to the table, localizing all of it as much as possible. It's a daunting task, but it may be that our future as a species depends on how well we do this. Fundamentally, it's about healing and regeneration. And as Gary Nabhan says, curbing the extinction of relationships. This panel tonight is about the challenge of localizing a regional food shed, and we have with us tonight some of the founding members of the Front Range Food Shed Alliance. These are some of the hidden heroes of our emerging local food system. But first, we should talk very briefly about what we're calling our Front Range Food Shed. It's important to define a food shed in terms of both the population that needs to be fed and the land base that is capable of feeding them to some degree. We've decided to focus on a region known as the Front Range Urban Corridor. This is an area where some 4.3 million people reside, including 85% of Colorado's population. This area encompasses 18 contiguous counties with 6 urban areas all the way from Cheyenne down to Pueblo. This is the primary market for local food in Colorado, and it also represents an important agricultural land base. Within these 18 counties, we find that there are currently more than 9 million acres of farm and ranch land. And of course, most of that acreage is currently devoted to animal pasturing, hay, and commodity crop production for export. But there is great potential here for sufficient food production to feed the entire population, the local population, to a significant degree. So we believe that in this context, a goal of 25% food localization could be achievable over a reasonable period of time. So what do we know about our food shed? Well, we know that currently only about 2 to 3% of our food supply is sourced locally. We know that increasing climate instability and water shortages are major limitations to the growth of food production. We know that conventional export-oriented agriculture almost completely dominates this landscape. And we know from a study that we did earlier this year that only about 12,300 acres of vegetables are being harvested each year in the entire Front Range. That doesn't include what people are growing in their backyards, though. We also know that many producers are experiencing high demand and want to expand their operations. We know that many institutional buyers are prioritizing local food and have set local food purchasing goals. We know that distributors and wholesalers and aggregators and processors all report that they need additional local food to meet the growing demand. So we know that the demand for local food far outstrips supply. And we also know that down in Denver, Mayor Michael Hancock this spring announced an official goal for the city of Denver of 20% food localization by 2020. We've also been learning that food localization is a process. And here's the essence of localizing our food supply in 4 major stages. This is an entire 4-day workshop in about a minute. To begin, we engage the community of eaters. And here the goal is increasing demand for and consumption of local food. This is all about education and awareness, which is a never-ending task. And as demand grows, we go to stage 2, where it's essential to engage the producers in the Front Range to increase production capacity, and I would also say diversity. This stage is very challenging, especially as many of our producers tend to see each other as competitors when the real competition is the global industrial food system. Then at some point it becomes essential to consciously develop the local food supply chain, which is going to become the heart of the regional food shed. So the goal here is to catalyze an integrated, collaborative, values-based system to connect producers and food entrepreneurs with their larger commercial markets. And this means rebuilding the missing local food infrastructure of aggregation, storage, processing, distribution, marketing. And this, in fact, is the focus of the Front Range Food Shed Alliance. The final stage is to expand the entire food system to ensure the long-term resilience of the food shed. And this stage, I would say, is kind of unknown territory, where nobody has gone before. In fact, nobody has localized their food supply anywhere in this country. In Vermont, they've gone farther than anybody else, and they're still only at 5%. So stage 3 calls for the development of a food shed alliance. That's kind of a B2B trade association for the emerging local food industry. And the purpose of the Front Range Food Shed Alliance is to build an integrated, resilient, collaborative, cooperative local food supply chain to serve the Front Range urban corridor. So tonight we have with us some of the founding members of the Front Range Food Shed Alliance who are all working on various aspects of food localization. And I want to ask each of them how their organization or company is involved in local food, what they do, along with a little bit about their view of the need for a Food Shed Alliance and their role within it. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Krista Roberts, who is president of Slow Food Denver, representing a diverse group of food enthusiasts dedicated to preserving local food traditions and heritage. And the organization is developing a robust Denver seed-to-table school food program. Krista.
Thanks, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Happy to be here. How many of you are familiar with the slow food movement? Wow, that's awesome. I don't usually see that many times. So for those of you who aren't, which are a few, and hopefully I'm not telling everyone else what they already know, Slow Food Denver is the local chapter in the Denver community that is part of this global grassroots movement. And we do a number of things, mainly through educational programming and various events to help do things in our community like connect people with local producers, local farmers, to help preserve food traditions, to help protect heritage breeds and heirloom varieties, and to advocate for sustainable food policy. And also, as Michael mentioned, a lot of our work is in the space of children and food and helping to educate kids about where their food comes from through school garden programming, and also working with local school districts to get more locally produced food into the cafeterias, and trying to make a connection between what's happening in the gardens and what's being eaten in the schools, and making that be also a place of learning, not just a place that you stop by on your way to recess. So that's some of what we do. Specifically, we host a number of different farm tours, both to rural farms as well as urban farms in Denver specifically, and focus a lot on taste education through cooking classes, preserving workshops, and community dinners that introduce people to local farmers and local products. And for some of the advocacy work, I am a member of the Mayor's Sustainable Food Policy Council. We also work with the state on agritourism and connecting more people with local farmers through that. In terms of our involvement with the Front Range Food Shed Alliance, it was really a no-brainer, because in terms of what it hopes to accomplish, it's very much aligned with our goals and our priorities, and I really see it as a way to strengthen the efforts that each one of us is working on by bringing together these groups that cross all areas of the food chain to create a much stronger and robust local food system. So that's why we're behind it.
Great. So next I'd like to introduce Dave Asbury, who's the owner of Full Circle Farms and the Rocky Mountain Pumpkin Ranch. Dave, I would say, is probably the largest organic producer in Colorado, stewarding more than 1,000 acres of cropland. Dave, thanks for being here tonight. Dave's fresh out of the field.
Thanks for humbling me again, Michael. This year's been a very humbling event for anybody involved in agriculture. We've had our share of events. We always do. It's a very challenging occupation, and I reluctantly do call myself a farmer. I have been for quite a while, but I don't think of myself as a dyed-in-the-wool farmer. I came from a kind of a different background, but I am reluctantly still a farmer, and it's just been the greatest humbling experience I've ever had so far. Coming from a the background that I had, it was great to be humbled, and it is always good to be humbled. Thank you once again for inviting me. I'm not sure.
Tell us a little bit about that background and how you got into farming.
Well, I went to school to be an agricultural teacher. Got out of that and stumbled into an occupation that was ag-related. I was working for a large food distributor in Denver, and I got a good taste of that, but it really didn't resonate well with me, so I thought, if you can't work for somebody else and enjoy it, you should go start your own business. So I did go out and start a wholesale operation, but once again, I couldn't find a lot of satisfaction in that. As I went around to the farms, I got to know the farmers, and I realized that, you know, these are the real salt of the earth people, and I didn't know what that meant probably at the time, but I just knew I wanted to get some of that salt. And lo and behold, be careful what you wish for. So now I've got a lot of salt, and it always seems to fall right in the wound at the worst possible time. But I do have a high sodium tolerance, so my brothers and a lot of my friends are engineers, doctors, etc. that have, I don't know, I call them normal jobs. And my brothers always said to me, "You need to relax, man. You need to take some time off. You work all the time." And I thought to myself, well, you kind of have to in this occupation. It's just part of it. But I do realize one thing, and I can promise you, in the occupation that I've chosen now, or it's chosen me, I guess, people eat every day, and it's really important that we eat every day, but what we eat is even more important. And I think that we see what's going on in the world now, and I think we're all guilty of not putting in enough good things in our body, and I just think to myself, well, at least I'm trying to do a good thing by, you know, trying to grow healthy crops. We are organic, and I have been ever since I really got my feet on the ground. I knew that's what I wanted to do. As many years ago as it was, the day I read Silent Spring, it was like, can never go back to the chemicals. So, you know, I come from it from a different view and angle, I guess, but it's been very enjoyable. I think that there is a tremendous amount of pent-up desire for what we can bring to the table, and unfortunately I see a lot of things that could be improved, and that's why I feel that I should, you know, have a touchstone with an organization like this, and the Bioneers, of course.
I'd like to introduce Julia Earlbaum, who is the founder of Real Food Colorado and a leader in the farm-to-school movement, working to develop the infrastructure that assists the growth of independent local food systems. Julia.
Hi. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me. So, just a brief overview on who Real Food Colorado is. We're a very, very small development organization, and we mainly focus on addressing the entire food system. And so what we mean by that is not top to bottom, but bottom, top, east, west, whichever direction you want to go. We tend to look at the entire food system as really the effort and the work to be done. We mainly focus on connecting infrastructure developments and systematic needs to programming and making sure that that actually speaks to the community that it resides in. And so we're pretty focused on listening to what each individual community wants, but making sure at the same time that those communities are connecting with each other. One of the things that's interesting about local food systems is they are birthed within very individualized communities with a very specific agenda, but the reality is our borders are invisible. We are connected with each other, and some of that connection needs to form into what Michael mentioned before, that integrated network, so that we can actually support each other in the next steps in the maturation of what the local food system is. Michael and I have often talked about the local food system really becoming its own industry, not in a negative way, but building our own rules to sustain ourselves, rather than trying to conform to the rules that have been established before us. And so one of the things that we focus on is actually moving between the 30,000-foot level to the on-the-ground implementation. I think what the Front Range Food Shed really has done, and we are only a small representation of a larger group of members, is that a lot of us come from an entrepreneurial background. We've come from different walks of lives, had different experiences, and we've managed to be able to parlay that into a passion that really is part of the supportive structure in building the local food system. And so I think it's part of that collaborative nature, and more importantly, the fact that we all want to work with each other, and we see the value of reaching out to others to work with us, as well as extend that network, is what is unique about this organization. And so I hope that as we proceed through the evening, that if you have questions, but more importantly are curious and interested about how you can be part of this, this would be a perfect time to quiz us, and believe me, it's worth your time. But we look forward to the rest of the evening.
So if I can get my technology going here, one of the people who could not be with us tonight is Buck Adams, who is one of the key entrepreneurial innovators in the Food Shed Alliance. He's the founder of Circle Fresh Farms, and more recently, Veterans to Farmers. It's a nonprofit organization developing a network of high production aeroponic greenhouses, training and employing American veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Buck couldn't be with us tonight because he's headed to Washington for congressional presentations connected with Veterans Day. It's a pretty big deal. What Buck represents is the emergence of controlled environment agriculture in the Front Range, which includes, of course, everything from hoop houses to high tunnels, aquaponics, hydroponics, and many different approaches to greenhouses. Buck makes a big point that among the industrial nations of the world, the U.S. ranks dead last in greenhouse crop production. Really interesting. And we are net importers of fresh fruits and vegetables. So Buck is using new greenhouse technology and vertical towers to reinvent the family farm at the local level, which he thinks can be scalable to the national level. With this technology on only 1 acre of land, it's possible to grow the equivalent of 10 acres of land-based production using just 10% of the water. That's 10 times the yield with 10% of the land, 10% of the water. And giving increasing climate instability and water shortages and coming water wars here in the Front Range, his approach is very, very important, I think. His plan is, phase 1, he's launching the Veterans to Farmers Training Center in partnership with the City of Denver. Phase 2, he's working with several developers in the Front Range to replicate the training center in other communities as a community amenity, along with a hyper-local farm. You know, our developers, he says, are realizing that they're not just building homes, but they're building community. Phase 3 is about national expansion through franchising and employee-owned farms. And what he's pointing to, I think, is one of the ways that local food can be quickly scaled. So with that, I'd like to now introduce Ben Mustin, who is the co-founder of Local, the first cannery in Colorado to focus solely on locally produced crops, partnering with local family farmers to can and preserve produce at the height of ripeness.
Thanks, Michael. You kind of stole my punchline there. That's exactly what we do. So I'm Ben Mustin. I'm one of the co-founders of Local. I started Local with my business partner Jim Mills in 2009 with the goal of building an authentic model for local food. that was really driven out of some experiences that we had working with a lot of folks in the food industry, who, when discussing this burgeoning demand for more local food that was out there, would explain to us all of the reasons why local food doesn't work. And that's been one of the hallmarks of my experience in founding Local and going on to do what we've done and continuing to grow, is this constant conversation about why local food doesn't work. And one of the things that we've been focused on from the beginning was just going out and proving how local food can work. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, to go do what we do. And we've been, I think, certainly it's been, as Dave said, a very humbling experience to do that, because when you choose to make all locally grown food, which is what we do, we partner with local farmers across the state to can and preserve locally grown produce. So every carrot, tomato, peach, pear that we buy is grown within the state of Colorado, and it's canned at our cannery in Denver. We use kind of traditional canning as well as live fermentation to preserve a great array of fruits and vegetables, all grown by organic farmers here in the state. But one of the things that certainly is hard about a local food model is that you expose yourself to the risks and also rewards, but primarily risks of local agriculture. So I think Dave and I got to share in some really fun commiseration of that this year, as we dealt with everything that Colorado had to offer as far as growing crops, and it was not awesome stuff that Colorado had to offer. So since we founded the company in 2009, we moved into a cannery in just north of downtown Denver. At this point, we employ about 40 full-time seasonal employees who work on our canning line. Everyone from recent college graduates to Ethiopian refugees to political refugees from El Salvador and Honduras. We love what we do. This year we'll end up preserving over 250,000 pounds of produce from Colorado organic farmers, which we're excited about. And so really excited as well to be a part of. You should not be clapping for me. You should be clapping for the people who do that every day, because it's hard work. We're really excited to be a part of the Front Range Food Shed Alliance, because I think one of the things that we really believe in as a company and as a community of folks who support what we do is that the most important part of this conversation is to talk about what does work with local food and what we can do and what we are doing with local food. And I think I'm very proud to be part of an organization, a group of people who have come together each in our own ways to do what we can do to make more local food available, and who are willing to get together and share that and make it a part of our conversation as a state and a community about where we think the future should go. So I'm really excited to be here and to be with a group of people who are also excited about turning a vision into action, because I think that ultimately that's what this is about. So thank you for having us.
Great. So what we'd like to do is open it up to questions and comments from you all and from the rest of the panel as well. So the floor is open here. Yes?
Yeah, so much of our calories come from grains, and what plans do you have for including grains in our local food shed?
Could somebody repeat your question for the audience?
Yeah. Who's going to take the question? Julia, you look like you're going for it.
No, I was actually just turning on the microphone.
Okay, well, so could you repeat the question?
The question was, so many calories are actually grain-based, and so what are the pending plans to introduce grains in Colorado? Or, well, no, plant and grow more grains here locally. He was shaking his head no.
Well, of course, one of the great ironies of that question is that we plant and grow plenty of grains locally here in Colorado. And yet, as is so often the case, it is much easier to sell those on a national and international commodity market than it is to market and sell them within our own state. So, I would point that out first. I think one of the things that we can do to make that happen is we can ask for local grains at our grocery stores and our retailers and farmers markets and seek out those who grow grains locally and ask them to sell them locally.
At Whole Foods, they sell millet from Colorado.
Why don't we use one of these for the audience?
Okay.
That way, because I'm filming and I'd like to get the.
Okay.
I just was going to mention at Whole Foods, they sell millet that's grown in Colorado there. So you can buy that.
One reason is we've lost all of our small town granaries. Boulder used to have a mill. Every town had a mill, and they've all disappeared to the big ConAgras and ADMs in the world. And they're starting to make a comeback in a small way, and that's how all things start, is in small ways. And we're starting to see a more small grains, more artisanal grains, as they like to be called. And I find I take issue with all things that are words like entrepreneur and niche, and all those words to me are, by the time they're in the general vernacular of the public domain, anybody that's been doing it, that really doesn't mean much to them, because that's just what they've been doing. They didn't need a name to know that they were, there's another word, maverick. No, nobody that likes to think that they're doing something different likes to have a label thrown on them. I personally don't like being, ear tagged as a farmer, because I think that in a sense it's like, I'm not so sure I really am a farmer sometimes. I might do it as an occupation, but those are big shoes to fill. But to get back to the grain thing, we need to see more small grain operations, and they are coming, and the technology is letting us, mill these forgotten grains and cereals that are out there, and that's going to open up a lot of avenues for somebody that's, has a desire and wants to be a entrepreneur and do something with that. So just a tremendous amount of opportunity.
Kristen.
One of the programs that Slow Food supports on an international level is its Arc of Taste. And so not only, this relates not only to grains, but all sorts of products that are could possibly be extinct or forgotten. And how do we find the people who are growing these products, raising these products, or preserving these food traditions that have been around, to highlight them and draw attention to them so that they can be resurrected, so to speak, or grow more and bring these products back to the different regions and eat them to save them, as some say. So that's another thing that is being encouraged by Slow Food in all different regions of the country, and hopefully will create some more demand for these things.
There's another wrinkle that I'd like to throw in here. Maybe we can talk about it a little, and that is we're learning from a lot of nutritionists these days that the kinds of grains that we're eating are damaging our health. So I think as we go forward, we need to pay a lot of attention to that. So these grains have been bred over decades, if not centuries, to be annualized grains, and they turn out to be not so great for not only for human bodies, but not so great for the land either. So out in Salina, Kansas, at the Land Institute, Wes Jackson has been developing different kinds of grains that are perennial. And Lynette Marie and I were just out there a few weeks ago for their Prairie Festival, and to be able to walk out into the fields and see these perennial grains actually growing and being tested out there is pretty exciting. So I hope that we will be seeing those kinds of grains be introduced into our food shed in the near future, because those kinds of grains they are good for the human body. They sequester carbon. they hold water in the soil, they regenerate the soil, unlike the kind of annualized grains that we're familiar with. Anybody else?
I would just add one more quick thing, which is I think another key piece of that is so much of the grain that we consume as a society is through highly processed food. And one of the things that I feel as though I've learned in working with farmers here in the state and working with grocers and everything like that, is that when you take ingredients and process them very highly, you're going to make them taste like whatever you add to them. And it's very difficult to create a commodity market that is based on quality, which ultimately is what we can use to differentiate local food, when our plan for that food is to essentially process the living bejesus out of it so that it tastes like whatever we add to it. So that would be, for me, a key piece of that.
One final thought. Dave brought it up before, and I think Ben rounded it out nicely. Oh, sorry. I don't like the sound of my own voice, sorry. But I think when it comes down to all food, it's not just grain, and it's not any of your meat proteins, it's not just those products that are just processed, is that we as consumers have a great deal of not only miles most often, but really just distance between where our food originates from and how it gets onto our plate. And so we tend to not remember, most likely because we have the luxury not to remember, that there are multiple infrastructures and steps that that particular product takes before it actually lands on your plate. And when we don't have those infrastructures and all the different support systems to have any of those food products localized, it makes it that much more difficult to ask a farmer to grow or raise that product, because you hope the market will actually respond to that product that you want them to grow or raise. And so there is a delicate dance that needs to happen within the local food system that combines both who grows and raises our food to who actually becomes part of that middle system, the locals of the world, as well as organizations like Slow Food Denver's and others that are actually trying to not only cultivate taste buds, but also bridge that gap, that huge gap between food acquisition and food retention. And that comes from the brain as well as through the taste buds as well as through your body. And that is what creates the marketplace. Because if you want to eat quinoa and the only place that sells it is 20 miles away from you, well, if you want to bridge that gap geographically in miles, then more people need to know what quinoa is, and more people need to want to eat it. And we can grow it, but if there isn't a marketplace, it isn't going to be grown.
Somebody has the mic. Yes?
This is kind of in reference to one of the phases you had up was introducing permaculture, was one of the points. And then also talking about how you're kind of trying to recreate your own rules around growing food. So I have a question about integrating growing animals with produce, and whether you think, as people that have been doing this for a long time, whether you think that's possible to do on a commercial scale, or if not, it's kind of going back to that idea of helping farmers work together and collaborate as opposed to having sort of an antagonistic competitive view of one another. So just kind of trying to maybe ask about what your hopes are for trying to include more silvopasture animal with food sort of models.
We're going to skip that question. Please, anybody.
I love cows. They're the cutest. I like goats and pigs, chickens too, but we don't have any on the farm except cows, and we feel that they're integral to our operation because we can't have them on the produce, of course. We did have a moose run through one time, and I was concerned for the story. But it's difficult with the food safety issues that we have to address, and it's very important. And there'll be a lot of the FDA. I mean, whoever thought the FDA would be on a farm, in a vegetable farm? Well, they will be. They are. So we have to take that into account. But yeah, there's a place for all things. You know, God's creatures, we're all here. And vegetables and animals can coexist. There's no question.
Slow food perspective.
The slow food perspective on animals, I think, or slow food believes that it does make sense and there is a place for it. I think probably one of the most prominent or at least well-heard examples of that is Joel Salatin and what he's doing. And there are plenty of other examples that maybe aren't as talked about as much, but I think it's, again, just, it's the lack of that is a product of our current food system. And as we work to change that, I think we will see more of that. And in terms of what we all are hopeful for, that has a very important place in the future of our food.
Okay.
I would say from my experience with working with a lot of farmers in this area, who do incorporate some degree of animal husbandry to their, vegetable or fruit growing, I think that as a community, we need to provide resources for local and humane slaughter of animals and processing of animals, if we'd like to actually see that be a really viable path for farmers. And I think we haven't raised a big enough stink to make that happen.
Just encouraging people to, because I know that there's meat shares and the CSA in the vegetable shares, and farmers that can get together and maybe put those two shares together. Because I've worked on a farm that has sustainable farming, and we're meat from them and our vegetables from another CSA. So maybe bridging those two farmers together to kind of get CSAs, streamline possibilities. And I'll add that just for knowledge about what's happening in our state, Ranch Foods Direct is a company based out of Colorado Springs, and Mike Calicrate is leading an effort to introduce mobile slaughterhouses to work with local ranchers to come to their ranches and process their animals. So I think there's some great progress being made. I'll also put a plug in for something that Slow Food is working on. Next year in June, we're going to have the first symposium around meat called Slow Meat. And the idea is to bring together people from all over the country to start. In 2015, it's going to take on more of an international focus. Like some of you may be familiar with slow cheese that happens in Italy, slow fish. And this is the same idea, but around meat. And to really ask people to consider meat and, from land and water use to production, to processing, to retail, to consumption. The question of how much meat should we really be eating. So the idea is that this should be a very safe forum that includes vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. That also includes conventional producers as well as grass-fed producers, and brings everyone together to really talk about how do we slow down meat and what does that mean to create a food system that is more focused on good, clean, and fair food. So stay tuned.
I would just add to this that I think that we're just beginning a rethink of our relationship to animals in our food supply chain. So I get a little uncomfortable when I hear us talk about animals as crops, that we raise and harvest and eat. And I think that there is a deeper kind of relationship that may be possible. And it just happens that Alan Savory, the founder of the Savory Institute, right here in Boulder, is introducing a way of managing our rangelands in such a way that they actually restore the land, sequester carbon. And when we think about the history of this region, I mean, this bioregion is short grass prairie, and it was home to huge herds of buffalo, and this was a very healthy ecosystem here. There was a relationship between the animals and the health of the land, the health of the soil. And I think that we need to incorporate that kind of thinking as we go forward in building our food system.
Yeah, there's one more question and we're running out.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Honored to have the last question. So a lot of what we've been talking about has a lot to do with just consumer knowledge and people being aware of where their food comes from, what the hell happens between the farm field and like their table, which is a lot to know. It seems pretty important for us to have that kind of generalized knowledge. And a couple of you have mentioned that you work in schools. So I want to ask, like, is the Front Range Food Shed Alliance, are there folks who you are aware of? What's being done to bring this kind of knowledge into the actual formal curriculum of, K-12 education? Like, are we teaching these sorts of things in our schools? Should we be? How do we make sure that that's happening? What are your thoughts?
So I can speak to what's happening in the schools around education about food. And currently, in terms of the work we've been involved in, mostly within Denver Public Schools and some of the surrounding districts, the education is happening more on the outskirts, not integrated into the main curriculum. But that's okay, I think. That's the right place to start, because there are ways to introduce this concept to children through school garden and garden programming. So kids are actually learning about where their food comes from. They're learning how to grow it. And then they're also learning how to cook it, which I think is another important aspect of that education. And then what we're seeing evolve from that is that the school districts are taking notice and looking at how do they integrate that work that's happening into the core part of the schools, whether it start with the cafeteria and then come into, a lot of the teachers are thinking about how do we use these garden spaces to support some of the lessons in the curriculum that we are teaching. And that's not just the obvious things around cultural and social sciences, but also art, getting the kids out in the gardens to do things that involve art, or science in terms of soils and weather patterns and that sort of thing. There are just so many opportunities to have learning happen around food that it just becomes sort of ingrained in it, as opposed to something that's got to be specific.
So I think your question is really important, and we don't have enough time to really delve into it. But Krista with Slow Food Denver gave you a really good description of what they've been doing through the school gardens. They've been doing a lot more than just with the school gardens. They've been actively engaging food service directors in how to locally source, which is really important. And so I think that goes under a larger program, which is known as Farm to School. And I'm just kind of making the assumption that a lot of you guys have probably at least heard that phrase. But school districts, at least in Colorado, and there are several throughout the state that have taken a huge leadership role in actually doing that, which is connecting not only food production, where whether they're actually buying from a local farmer or maybe even growing their own, but actually tying that into really a long-term development process with children starting from pre-K all the way up. DPS, as being one of the school districts, and Boulder County, Ann Cooper, I think some of you guys know who she is, does a lot of innovative sort of, I'm just going to go ahead and do it and find the local products and bring it into a school food menu. And she labels it, she shares that education. DPS is actually farming their own lands. They're the second largest landowner in Denver County. They have 50 acres of underutilized lands, and they're actually spending more money to water their lands, grass, than they are doing anything else. And we were part of a team that did a feasibility study, and that basically shown that out of 25 acres, they could actually grow almost all their fresh produce that they would need to use seasonally. And so now they're actually starting that program. There are several districts throughout the country that are doing that. Hawaii, Vermont, California, Portland. that's city, but Oregon. But there's several states all over the country that are doing it. Just remember, in Denver, they just voted no to spend extra money for supporting education. So until, as a society, we actually prioritize what's actually important to us, these are all baby steps. But Ben wanted to highlight, what are we doing right? This is what we're doing right. You're giving up a Friday night to sit in a room to listen to the four of us talk to you. So this is the first step. And as long as we continue to do this, and as long as we welcome organizations and other individuals who whether they're entrepreneurs or not, who actually want to be part of this, that's the step that we're taking towards. And honestly, you're part of the solution.
Great note, Dan.